Good afternoon. My name is Peter Gaggia. I'm president of the Tea Association of the USA and the Tea Council. And it's been my pleasure to help in today's presentation and the symposium, International Scientific Symposium on Tea and Human Health. At this point, I'd like to first thank, with great thanks to Doctors Jeff Blumberg and Aideen Cassidy for co-chairing the symposium. It's been a wonderful day, and the chat comments have really come through about this being a tremendous learning session. And I can only thank them and all concerned who has helped bring the power of tea to such a broad audience that has attended today. So thank you very much. I'd like now to move on to our media session, and just a couple of comments on tea. That it is the most widely consumed beverage in the world, next to water, and it can be found in almost 80% of all U.S. households. And it really is in the U.S., it is served both hot and iced, although iced is predominant, which makes us very unique in the world today. And on any given day, almost 160 million Americans are drinking tea. So true tea, that is black, green, oolong, dark, and white teas, all come from the same plant, Camellia sinensis. And the differences among these 5 types of teas strictly lie in the way that tea is processed at origin, really related to the level of oxidation that is allowed to occur. The key element of tea is its flavonoids. These are naturally occurring compounds that are believed to have antioxidant properties. And flavonoids provide bioactive compounds that help to neutralize these free radicals, which scientists believe over time damage elements in the body, such as genetic material and lipids, and that those elements that contribute to chronic disease. Tea also contains L-theanine, an amino acid that is, for the most part, uniquely found in tea. Every day, new findings from the international scientific community lend credibility to tea's healthy properties, and we are pleased to provide this comprehensive update of recent research on the benefits of tea consumption on human health from all these leading scientists. I'd like now to move on to our speakers this afternoon who will summarize their talks. Our first will be Dr. Louise Dye. And Louise is professor of nutrition and behavior at the University of Leeds. She is a chartered health psychologist and is associate editor of Nutritional Neuroscience and the European Journal of Nutrition. And I will now turn it over to Louise. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. It's a pleasure to be here. And I was really pleased at the interest in the symposium today about the stuff, the evidence I was providing on the effects of tea and tea components on cognitive function. Summarizing that evidence very briefly, I looked particularly at randomized controlled trials, and they support the conclusion that tea can produce short-term acute beneficial effects on attention. And that's attention measured by objective tests. So these are cognitive tests that give us an objective outcome. I don't know about you guys, but I'm getting some feedback. Is anyone else getting feedback? I don't want to make it difficult.
Could put themselves on mute until you're on stage. Thanks.
Let's see if that's a bit better. Yeah, so both objective measures of attention and subjective feelings of alertness are responsive to ingestion of tea. And what the studies consistently show is that that active ingredient that Peter just mentioned, L-theanine, combined with a slightly lower dose of caffeine, actually have beneficial effects on the ability to sustain performance. And what that means is that combined in the sorts of quantities that you would get in a cup of tea, actually improve attention. So the effects of tea have been attributed to this really unique combination of low caffeine and L-theanine. And then when we look at L-theanine in particular, it shows that L-theanine can reduce cortisol response to acute stress. So when we experience a stressful event, our cortisol goes up. Consuming L-theanine attenuates that response, and it also attenuates the cardiovascular responses, the increased blood pressure and heart rate that we show when we're confronted with an acutely stressful situation. That's happening in the periphery. What happens centrally is that there is an increase in alpha activity measured by EEG, and that coupled with the sustained attention improvement that I've just mentioned. So together, those effects on cortisol, on cardiovascular response, and on alpha activity suggest that tea may confer stress-reducing effects. And then there's really good evidence that tea and its constituents seem to be particularly beneficial for people under conditions of stress, because lots of the evidence has been done in healthy adults, showing some benefits to attention. But when you look at people who are in a stressful situation, the evidence is a bit stronger. And that the most profound cognitive domain is attention and alertness. So we see less effects on memory and most on this ability to focus attention. And I think that what that suggests is that in conditions where people have elevated stress, there may be some really beneficial effects, both objectively and subjectively, on our experience of stress. Thank you.
Thank you, Louise. Our next speaker, our next session was presented by Dr. Jonathan Hodgson, who is in Australia, and as a result, he was on tape. But he leads the new Institute for Nutrition Research at Edith Cowan University. And the primary focus of Professor Hodgson's research is to better understand how plant foods and their components contribute to human health. In Dr. Hodgson's stead, he will ably be represented by Aideen Cassidy, who will take us through the key points of his presentation today.
Thank you. So in Jonathan's talk, he presented the importance of tea and the flavonoid constituents, mainly the flavontriols, in relation to cognitive decline, and presented a range of data from population-based studies. So looking at habitual intake in large populations and how higher intakes are associated with reduction in risk. He talked about dementia and Alzheimer's, and in particular vascular dementia. And of course, because we have no effective drug therapies for these disorders, we really are needing to focus on the prevention of these conditions. And it's thought that about 40 to 50% of dementia could be prevented through changes in lifestyle and diet. And there is some growing evidence from the population-based studies that both he and some colleagues have conducted that just simple change to increasing intake to 1 or 2 cups of tea a day could significantly reduce the risk of vascular dementia and potentially Alzheimer's disease. So there's been increasing evidence that regular tea consumption may provide protection. And actually, as time has gone on, the quality of the data that we've collected in prospective cohort studies has got better. And starting as little as 1 cup a day and up to 5 to 6 cups a day, there is a reduced risk of dementia associated with this level of intake. So data from these studies also finds that moderate intakes of the flavonoids that are present in tea, mainly the flavontriols, seem to be associated with a reduction in risk of cognitive decline. So could it be that the flavonoids are explaining these beneficial effects of tea? The maximal benefits of the tea are obtained with as little as 2 to 4 cups per day, with little additional benefit of higher intakes. The results of these studies also suggest that the protection provided may be strongest for vascular dementia rather than other forms of dementia.
Thank you, Aideen. Our next speaker is Taylor Wallace, who is Dr. Taylor Wallace, is principal and CEO at the Think Healthy Group and a professor in the Department of Nutrition and Food Studies at George Mason University. His academic research interests are in the area of nutritional interventions to promote health and prevent the onset of chronic disease. Over to you, Dr. Wallace.
Yeah, thank you. This is that was kind of a great opener for my presentation because I think it details, for those of you all that represent the mainstream media, of how intricately linked the body is. And we see that the very same foods in general that affect cardiometabolic disease or the cardiovascular system also affect cognition and the cerebrovascular system. And so you're going to see a lot of consistencies with my presentation and the former presentation. We know that cardiometabolic diseases are the #1 cause of death worldwide, especially cardiovascular disease, and that tea intake is associated with a decrease in cardiometabolic outcomes, so heart attacks, stroke, and such. We know tea is a major source of flavonoids in the diet, at least those flavin-3-ols. Tea represents by far tea consumers by far have a much higher intake of flavin-3-ols than non-consumers, over 20 times higher flavonoid intake. And again, it's the second most common beverage consumed across the world. So what we did in our presentation, very similar. We showed data from our recent 2 systematic reviews, an umbrella review, and then I highlighted some really novel studies. And the point to take is that the data when it comes to tea and cardiometabolic outcomes is very consistent. So you have large population studies that are all very consistent, 39 of them to be exact, that are all very consistent that tea intake reduces the risk of all-cause mortality due to cardiovascular disease, cardiovascular events like heart attacks, stroke events. And then you see smaller randomized control trials that really allude to that tea has an influence over several biological mechanisms in the body. So what we call flow-mediated dilation, which is the elasticity of the veins and arteries, and how blood can easily flow through the body. We see that there might be some effects on certain lipids and blood pressure. We see that there are effects on cross-communicating proteins that regulate inflammation in the body. Very important right now in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic because the ACE2 enzyme lies in the renin-angiotensin system, which controls blood pressure and a lot of our cardiovascular outcomes. So each cup of tea was associated with a 1.5% lower risk of all-cause mortality, 4% lower risk of CVD mortality, 2% lower risk of CVD events, and 4% reduction in stroke events. And I should say that while this might not seem huge, remember, this is just one component of the diet. We like to think of nutrition science as a reductionist approach, but people don't just consume tea. They also have a whole host of other dietary patterns that can accumulate and have large effects of a good dietary pattern. And tea actually shows some pretty promising results when compared to other components of the diet. When you look at all this different types of data from laboratory animal studies where we can dissect animals and show the exact mechanisms of tea flavin-3-ols to the population-wide studies where you look at population effects and the smaller randomized control trials that are very controlled, you see a lot of consistency among the data, and that's what makes us so certain that tea has these beneficial effects. At the same time, all of our reviews and research has really shown that tea as a beverage, there's no adverse event. So there's no harm to consuming tea. As long as you're consuming the unsweet tea that doesn't provide a lot of added sugar to the diet, there's no harm to it. So from a public health standpoint, it's time to recommend 1 to 2 cups of tea per day, in my opinion.
Thank you, Taylor. Next is Dr. Raul Zamora-Ross, who's currently the principal investigator at the Unit of Nutrition and Cancer at Belvitka Biomedical Research Institute, or IDIBEL. His interests lie in whether dietary factors, particularly polyphenols and polyphenol-rich foods, are causally associated with the development and prognosis of chronic diseases, especially cancer. Dr. Zamora-Ross.
Well, thank you. In this presentation, I have presented some of the more recent evidence on tea and cancer prevention, especially in primary cancer prevention. We cannot forget that cancer is the second leading cause of mortality worldwide. And even that cancer is a genetic disease, it's mainly caused by environmental factors, and we can say that approximately between 30 and 40% of the cancers can be prevented by modifiable risk factors, especially avoiding tobacco, increasing physical activity, and having a healthy diet. There is a lot of evidence regarding tea and cancer prevention, and we can summarize higher intakes of tea consumption may reduce the risk of some cancers, especially cancers of the biliary tract, breast, endometrial, liver, and oral cancer. We know that there is a lot of evidence, especially mechanistical studies, saying that tea, especially flavanols, they have a lot of potential anti-carcinogenic activities, and those can be really related, or it's important to study this effect between gut microbiota, tea components, and cancer risk. And one of the major points is, a part of having these potential beneficial effects, and there is a lot of studies that are inconclusive, so we need more studies on this outcome, especially clinical trials with a better estimation of the intake of tea. So thank you.
Thank you, Raul. Da-Young Wu is currently a scientist and associate director of the Nutritional Immunology Laboratory, USDA Human Nutrition Research Center on Aging, and associate professor at the Friedman School of Nutrition Science and Policy at Tufts University. Regrettably, Dr. Wu was unable to attend the session, so his report will be summarized by Dr. Blumberg.
Thank you, Peter. Actually, Dr. Wu was able to attend. He just couldn't get an internet connection that worked to get him into the platform. So it was really regrettable. But his talk will be recorded now and made available on the website so that attendees and you can watch it. So in the summary slide that he had created, he just stressed that tea is really a component of a healthful dietary pattern. And we know that dietary patterns have a big effect on the immune system and increase the body's resilience to illness. And the tea can do this in part because of its bioactive flavonoids. Moreover, it's not just a matter of reducing the risk for getting an infectious disease or even an autoimmune disease. It helps your body respond to illness when you do have an infection, for example. So it can help maintain a resilience of the immune system and promote health and help you prevent getting infectious diseases. As I just noted, it's these flavanols, sometimes called catechins, that have been shown to help the host fight off pathogens. So it's really clear that like the same bioactive component that's benefiting cardiometabolic disease, for example, or even neurodegenerative diseases, is the same one that helps to boost the immune system. There is an emerging area of research that's now showing that the green tea flavonoids can help improve autoimmune disorders by promoting self-tolerance and suppressing autoantigen-induced inflammatory attacks and enhancing tissue repair. These are all components of the immune system that are impaired when an autoimmune disease begins to become manifest. And it seems clear from observational studies and some basic research that tea may have a real beneficial effect here. But when we talk about the anti-infection effects of green tea in particular, where most of the studies have been done, it's clear that there are several mechanisms that these bioactive components can affect. They have direct antiviral effects by inhibiting the absorption, the penetration, the membrane fusion, the replication of viruses in the upper respiratory tract. So they can work to directly fight these things as well as enhancing immune responses to clear the virus. And as we've heard from some of the other conditions, whether cancer or cardiometabolic diseases, these tea flavanols have an anti-inflammatory and antioxidant effects that help reduce tissue damage. So all sorts of conditions here then that we think are important, and enhancing immune response is something that consumers are ever more interested in these days of the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm not suggesting that tea prevents COVID-19 infections, but it does help to promote a better baseline immune responsiveness. So against all viral and bacterial infections, tea is helpful. And his conclusion that tea is a tasty, inexpensive beverage that brings with it certain benefits in a broad array of metabolic and immune aspects is certainly true. I would just add that not only does it have positive attributes, it has no negative attributes. So when you substitute tea for less healthful beverages like sugar-sweetened beverages, you are actually reducing risk for chronic diseases even more through boosting immunity and avoiding those things that depress it. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. Our next presenter is Dr. Mario Ferruzzi, who is professor and chief of the section of developmental nutrition in the Department of Pediatrics at the University of Arkansas for Medical Sciences. Dr. Ferruzzi's research interests are in the study of micronutrient and phytochemical bioavailability, metabolism, and impact to human health. Dr. Ferruzzi.
Thank you. So I guess I had the distinct pleasure of kind of thinking of the translational piece. And in my presentation today, we really covered a lot about dietary guidance and to a large extent, focusing on how we can create that message for consumers. So I think we can go to the next slide. So hearing all the great research that was presented ahead about tea consumption and the potential to modify risk for many of these chronic and degenerative diseases. And I think the big one for me when thinking of putting my talk together was to choose the one with the greatest amount of information to lead us to something that is useful to consumers. And frankly, that is really cardiovascular effects that we see. So the big part there that's important in our presentation today was focusing on the fact that currently, while we have great data suggesting these benefits, there's really limited guidance in the U.S. dietary guidance system to support what I would say clear recommendations for consumers. So how do consumers get the benefits of tea? And are we making sure that when we do generate products, those products are consistent with the types of products that are showing benefits in clinical or in other analyses? And the key thing here is to really distinguish tea in and of itself and not confuse it with other tea-like beverages, herbal infusions. While those may also be healthy, that's not where the data are, right? The data are sitting with tea, the Camellia senescens true tea products. And the full spectrum of those teas, while they differ compositionally, seem to deliver very similar benefits, which is indicative to us that there's an interplay between what's happening post-consumption in the gut and with the human metabolism to generate the right response. And over the last 10 years or even 15 years, the evidence has been building to the point where I think we have what I would suggest are very clear data that support the tea consumption and cardiovascular benefit. So how do we translate that to dietary guidance? Finally, now in 2020, tea as a beverage is mentioned in U.S. dietary guidance, but primarily for what's not in tea, and that is excessive calories. What our talk today was really about was focusing more on how do we build an evidence base now to understand more about a dietary reference intake value for these beneficial compounds in tea, these flavanols, and how that can help guide dietary guidance to build more positive messaging and then clear guidance in terms of overall consumption. And so establishing dietary reference intakes for these bioactive flavonoids in tea is absolutely critical. And I think we have some evidence to suggest, based on the meta-analyses of randomized clinical trials, as well as some of the observational studies, that we're in that 200 to 400, 200 to 600 milligram range. And that translates roughly to 1 to 2 cups of tea that is conducted by standard brewing practices. And I believe we may not get to a DRI in the short term, but using that process can help guide us in a direction where we can build additional recommendations that are more accurate and relevant for consumers in the context of a diverse range of tea products that we have out on the market. So with that, I'll stop. Jeff, I think you're muted.
I was muted. So I have the privilege of just wrapping up what I feel are the main talking points that came out of this very diverse summary with all these international experts. Number one is that the interest in the relationship between tea consumption, health promotion, and disease prevention continues to grow, with over 9,000 publications now in the scientific literature. That's an astonishing number, but of course, when you recognize that this goes back almost 50 years or more, it's not so astonishing. But the point is, and we heard about evidence from basic research in vitro, in silico, animal models about the benefits of tea on cancer, cardiometabolic disease, and cognitive performance and immune function, all the way to randomized clinical trials and large-scale observational prospective cohorts. The evidence is really consistent that we're seeing these benefits. That what you heard from Dr. Taylor is that we are one body, and these systems of the immune system and the cardiovascular system and the brain, what's good for one tends to be good for the others. And these dietary bioactive components, the flavonoids that we find so richly in tea, seem to be having a real benefit here. Advances in nutrition research for precision health that include now a more comprehensive and holistic approach where we look at the influence of the genome and the metabolome, and the microbiome, all promise new insights into health benefits of tea, where we can show the evidence that even when one size doesn't fit all, that all may benefit in different ways from the consumption of tea. So I'll just reiterate what Dr. Ferruzzi had to say, is that I think we have sufficient evidence now, sufficient, strong, credible, substantiated evidence is available to improve dietary guidance to consumers that tea and other beverages rich in these bioactive components like flavonoids are something you should choose. Tea is a healthy beverage and provides these health benefits. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you all for joining, and thank you to all of our speakers for giving a great summary of their presentations. We will now open it up to questions. If anyone has questions for a specific speaker, please drop your question in the chat with the name of the speaker you would like it directed to, and we will relay the question.
There is one question that has come in, not directed to anyone in particular, and that would be that clearly based on the presentations that everyone is saying that tea should be consumed more frequently, knowing that that recommendation is not going to come through the USDA and the dietary guidelines. Would it make sense to work with any particular organization, health organization, to get that recommendation? And if so, which one?
I think we are, in fact, beginning to see that happening. There are professional organizations, whether we talk about the American Heart Association, the American Society for Nutrition, the International Academy for Food and Nutrition Science, and the Academy for Nutrition and Dietetics, have been developing guidelines or providing summary reports, not on tea per se, but on these dietary bioactive components. And the flavonoids have certainly been one big issue that they have been focusing on. We think that the Academy for Nutrition and Dietetics, the A&D, in fact, has prepared such a report. I'll let Dr. Taylor answer when we can expect to see that released. But the idea that we should look at things beyond essential nutrients like vitamins and minerals and carbohydrates, that this whole big issue of dietary bioactive components, most of which are from plant foods, that when we recommend a more plant-based diet, what we're talking about is consuming more of these components like the flavonoids, of which tea is a very rich source. Dr. Taylor, can you comment about the Academy's recommendations?
Yeah, well, I'll make a couple of comments. And, I think from a policy perspective, that you will start to see more recommendations around things like flavonoids, tea. And I think that's due to a couple of things. One, for essential nutrients, we've always had an established process of how we develop our dietary reference intakes or our recommendations around essential nutrients. There's been a lot of debate over the last 10, 20 years on how to do that for some of these bioactive compounds. And if you notice with the sodium and potassium DRIs that were updated in 2019, there's now a chronic disease risk reduction point for the first time. And I think building on that, you'll start to see certain bioactive components like flavonoids will start to develop those CDRR-like values for. I think what is nice about the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics working group that is developing this clinical guideline and intake recommendation that I'm so honored to be a part of is that it will push policy bodies like the national academies to start looking at recommended intakes for bioactives, so CDRR, chronic disease risk reduction, like values for these bioactives. And I think then you will start to see them be more incorporated in policy. And then, of course, things like tea, apples, berries, cinnamon will have a better place in dietary guidelines. I also think in the past that dietary guidelines have missed the whole flavonoid thing. And I think you'll see a big push from the scientific community, as there was last time, to start incorporating some of this type of data. As far as when the guideline comes out from the Academy Working Group, we plan to submit it to the journal in mid to late May. And I would assume that it would take about a month to review and get ready to publish from the journal. So I think you'll be seeing it by early this summer.
Yeah. Thanks, Taylor. I mean, as a scientist, I would always want to say science comes first and then consumers will change their behavior. But Mario, you made an interesting comment during the symposium. If you know what I'm talking about, you want to share that perspective?
Yeah, sometimes I think, guidance and policy sometimes follow behavior, right? So with growing awareness of products like tea and products, Taylor, you mentioned cinnamon, you mentioned several of the spices. I think, consumers are getting their information from lots of places. Not saying it's all correct, but the point is behavior will tend to drive us to hopefully be very deliberate in what we develop in terms of recommendations that hopefully reinforce good behaviors and guide us away from bad behaviors. But when it comes to tea, I think you said it, Jeff, the risk on this is quite low. And so when you have such evidence of positive health benefits and you have such low risk, I agree with what Taylor was saying. I think, yes, we can partner with the Academy. We can partner. IFINS is obviously putting out a framework for DRIs now for bioactives, which is seeing good positive feedback. I think what we're doing here today, these are all important avenues to reinforce the message. And hopefully we moved the needle a little bit in the last dietary guidelines, but it wasn't that long ago. If you go back to 2010, cocoa and cocoa flavanols were mentioned for cardiovascular benefits in the DGAC report, right? It didn't make it to the final guidelines, but the notion was seeded then in 2010. So we have an opportunity to kind of pull these together, and it may not be just a tea message. It may be a broader flavonoid message. I think, Taylor, you presented some of the interesting findings, or what I would say that what the Cosmos study is doing. That's going to lift everything in terms of our ability to look at something that's not necessarily a recognized nutrient, but know that it's part of the story for fruit benefits. We have fruit consumption guidelines. Part of the story there is some of these other components, which just so happen to be richer in tea. So I think that's where we're going to go and hopefully move that needle.
Oh, okay. Thank you. There is another question, and that is helping consumers distinguish between herbal teas and what we call true teas, or those teas that are from the plant Camellia sinensis. It's a long term to have to communicate for consumers. Would anyone like to address that?
Boy, I think that's a challenge. There was also an interesting study that just came out yesterday. I saw it blast across one of my things on rooibos and yellowbush tea, as well as in terms of some nice data. But yeah, that is a distinction. We are talking about Camellia senescens here. And again, I think maybe we've lost some ownership of what the term tea means to a consumer, whether or not it is from a regulatory perspective, especially in the United States. But it doesn't mean we can't reinforce that message with the teas we know and love in terms of black tea, oolong tea, green tea. So being very specific and deliberate about what we say on our package and in our statements is going to be critical there, because the data just aren't there on the other products. Yeah.
Can I add to that as well? Because obviously in terms of the cognitive effects of tea, those are very different to the data that we have on herbal teas. And one of the issues there is that the quality of studies that has been done with green tea and black tea components and teas per se are much, much stronger than the quality of the studies that has been done in the herbal area. We've, with ILSI Europe, we're in the process of finalizing 2 papers, both of them systematic reviews of the effects of natural ingredients. Tea fits into the natural ingredient review. A lot of the components of these herbal teas didn't meet the criteria for a good study to be included in the review. So I would say the strength of the evidence is much stronger for the black teas, the Camellia brand varieties, than these other herbals, which could have a real hodgepodge of ingredients and actives.
Thank you. And there is another question, and that is that you, Louise, were talking about stress and how tea alleviates that. Do you think that tea could be a beverage that would help consumers in the midst of COVID, when giving your example of the zebra running and then having to stop, and knowing that we're, the consumers have been stuck in this situation and don't know how to get out. Did you have any thoughts that you might like to add?
Yeah, the zebra is really well adapted to switch on and switch off. It's fight or flight syndrome. So it kind of restores itself to a steady state very quickly. Unfortunately, that's not so easy for humans. We switch on our stress response, and one of our problems is that we don't resolve it, so we stay stressed. what I showed in the presentation was that some of the active ingredients in tea can attenuate the stress response. They can lower the salivary cortisol that would normally set you up to run away. It can slow down your blood pressure and your heart rates that you'd normally need for that fight or flight response. And also that it increases alpha waves. So alpha waves are associated with relaxation in the brain. There's another aspect though, and that's the behavioral component. It's the associations that we have psychologically with sitting down and having a cup of tea. When there's a crisis, what do? You put the kettle on. So there are lots of learned associations between drinking that particular beverage and having a positive response. So some of the data that I showed shows there's real physiological underpinnings, but the psychological processes that are about, relaxing, having a cup of tea, sitting down, taking stock, those are just as important.
There are no other questions unless anyone wants to send them through. But thank you. Thanks to all of you for a great session and a wonderful symposium.
I just wanted to add my thanks first to all the presenters for really excellent work, to Jeff and Aideen for their extraordinarily competent co-chairing. I also like to acknowledge Polyc Communications, Louise, Christina, and Evie for all the work that they've done on this event, coordinating it and actually executing it. And finally, I would be remiss in not thanking two kind of fathers of this event, and that would be Joe Simrani, my predecessor, who coordinated symposiums 1 through 5, and Marty Kushner, who pounded into everybody that we really need to do this back in 1988. So thanks to those two for getting us on the right railroad track. And I wish everyone a great day, and thank you so much for all your inputs and all your people who attended. Thank you.